Yeah, why don't you mute everybody, Jeannie?
That's what I'm going to do is mute all, and I'm going to unmute Bruce. So that'll work.
I got me.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Bruce.
Ready to go?
Yep, we're ready to go.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for letting me come and talk a little bit about a few of the subjects that I think you're interested relative to criminal justice. And I did read through everything that the league has, and they did cover so much. And I was kind of concerned at first when I was talking to Judy, about deflection and diversion, but it is soundly in there. So it's very much in what the league has been looking at. But I'm going to kind of try and give you an overview of some of these topic items, and I'll move kind of as quickly as I can. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, or just stop and interrupt me. You could even you can't throw anything at me because we're on Zoom. If we were in person, I would gladly try to deflect whatever you throw. But so what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about policing. And I know I look really young, but I started policing in the early 80s. Went to Chicago's Police Academy and became what I think is a traditional police officer. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So, but to understand where we're going and where we are now, we got to look back just a little bit. So going to talk a little bit about the three eras of policing. And the first one was the political era. And I don't know if any of you have seen some movies, but certainly it's depicted when people basically come to the United States. Maybe they get off the ship and they're met by oftentimes those that are interested in getting elected, politicians, and police officers. And back in the day, in this 1840s up till 1930s, the police really worked as political entities. So they were put into office and they were able to become police officers by a political appointment. So typically that meant you served, you also served the needs of that political entity. So whether that's a mayor or whoever it actually was. But interestingly enough, back in those days, the police did a lot of good things. So they actually worked soup kitchens, and they did all kinds of good things to help individuals. But definitely there was a lot of political influence. And that led to what really was corruption and some issues with police officers and how they policed, not necessarily always objectively. So in about the 1930s, there became this new era of policing, and it was the reform era. And the idea here was well-intentioned, but it had some consequences. And the intention was to separate the police from the politicians. So they would be much more professional. There was this concept of education and training, and the police profession, law enforcement as a whole, started to embrace technology and just become much more professional. But when they did that, they kind of pushed themselves away from the community, from these opportunities of graft and corruption. So the idea was a good idea to try to professionalize the police, but it separated the police from the community as an us and them. And I know all of you have kind of heard that in police kind of jargon and thought processes, that the police are separate from the community, and it's what we in the police world would call us, the police, and them, the community. And that had some issues. So we saw through the 1960s and literally through the 60s, all kinds of issues came about. And most of you have better recollections of history. And I talk to Judy and Jeannie, pretty regularly. What happened during this time, though, is a lot of demonstrations, a lot of civil rights demonstrations, lots of issues really about authority and specifically the police. And crime began to pretty much go out of control. And there was a need for a different kind of policing. And the kind of policing that the United States started to settle on was this concept of community policing. And we have the community era of policing that really took effect somewhere in the 60s. Some will say it started in the 70s, and that has taken us all the way till present day. And there's some different variations of community policing, but that's where we are today. So I think it's important to know, okay, how did we get to this place, and what does it look like, currently and going forward? So just real quickly, political era, politics and law were the authorization. Reform era, we had law and professionalism. The community era, which is now we have community support, law and professionalism. And I won't go into too much detail, but the idea of community policing is to work with the community. It's building community relationships and solving problems together. Not the traditional law enforcement that I grew up with, even in the 80s. So even in the 80s, it was arrest and that was your function. We didn't necessarily solve a lot of problems. We kept going back to the same problems over and over again. So I won't bore you with too much more of that. But I know in speaking to some of you that this is really interesting. In 1829, really smart guy named Sir Robert Peel in England had some principles of policing. And trust me, I would not put this in here if it wasn't worth you looking at. So the basic mission of policing to prevent crime and disorder, we know that. This is important. The police need public approval and respect. In a while, I'm going to talk about police legitimacy. And way back in 1829, here, Sir Robert Peel, already had this in his head. Police need to secure cooperation of the public to observe the law. That's hugely important. As the degree of cooperation diminishes proportionately, the necessity for the use of force increases. How interesting is that? So if the community is not on your side and you don't have relationships with the community, guess what? Your potential for the use of force, which causes all kinds of consternation for law enforcement today, goes up. So if we have relationships, we have good relationships with the community, the propensity to use force goes down. I think that's really interesting, and that he came up with this so long ago. Police must demonstrate absolute impartial service to the law. And boy, I could give you a lot of examples how that doesn't happen necessarily today. And police use of force should only be necessary to secure the observance of the law or to restore order. Very important. Again, we talk about, unfortunately, police officers that find themselves using excessive force. And that was obviously seen as a problem, again, way back in 1829. And this is, I love this, the concept that the police are the public and the public are the police. There is no us and them. There is no differentiation between the two. We're in it together. And only because the public allows the police to be the police, can the police, actually, be enforcers of the law. Without that consent, and without that, communities saying, yes, we want you, we need you. And, this is something that we acquiesce our arrest powers to you. That's a huge piece. And I think it's hugely important. Police are not to judge guilt or punish the guilty. So this concept of street justice, the concept of, I've heard this, you can beat the rap, but you can't beat the ride. So that kind of concept where there's going to be some street justice, not appropriate. And this is the bottom line. The test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder. And I just want to give you a quick personal experience. So I was a police chief in the Round Lake area for about 11 years. And I came to that department from a much larger department. And when I got there, we had all kinds of issues. Truly, we had some gang issues. We had, some real violent behavior that was taking place. And, I did a lot of good things. But one of the things that I did is I brought a lot of law enforcement together. I brought all kinds of task forces. I brought all kinds of entities in to help me police that community. And, all the stops we made, all the arrests we made, all the things that I did to try to stop that violence, really, I can tell you how many numbers of people we arrested. I could tell you, how many citations we wrote. I could tell you all those numbers. But in the end, to the community, that didn't matter. What they really were seeking is the absence of crime and disorder. So me as the police chief, where I can say I made X, my department made X number of arrests, or I had the Illinois State Police or the Lake County Gang Task Force, or I had X number of people in. Ultimately, that wasn't the true measure of my efficiency as a police department. It really was a reaction, very much a reaction to reactive way to try to deal with, in this case, gang violence. So I can just tell you from my perspective, it's almost easy to try to go out and arrest people. It's difficult to try to change the systems and the community culture as a whole to actually affect change within that community for whatever crime issues you're having. And it could be in my case, it was gang behavior and some of the crimes associated with it. But back to Peel, he was right. The community wasn't happy, even though we made all these arrests. It still didn't stop. It didn't change their quality of life. It still did. It still looked like, that we didn't have this absence of crime and disorder. I hope that makes sense to you, but it's a lesson that I learned, and I realized, arrests are a component of what the police do. It's not the whole picture of what the police do, and we'll talk more about that. So just a little bit about community policing. It's all about partnerships with the community. It's all about problem solving. The idea that you go back to the same calls over and over and over again is the definition of insanity. When you expect a different result and do the same thing. So the idea that you bring the community together, they come in and they help you to determine, one, what the problem is, because I find that police often think they know what the problem is until they survey the community. And then actually, that's not the problem. That's not really what's concerning the residents in the community. So determine what that problem is and then come together to solve it. And sometimes the police aren't the appropriate entity to solve the problem. So lots and lots about that. And then this concept of organizational transformation. This is the idea that there's a overarching philosophy of community policing within that police department and within the community. And the idea of that is, if I put police officers on bicycles and I send them out into the community, is that community policing, right? Maybe it's a program or component of community policing, but that's not community policing, right? So it's got to be overarching in everything you do. And that means we also have to include the community in most of what we do. So we have to be completely transparent. And I'm going to talk about hiring and promoting and all these other things that we do with police and why we should have community involvement in all of those things. So as transparent as you can get is the positive way to go. So I won't go through these, but certainly we want to arrest offenders, prevent crime, solve the ongoing problems, and improve the overall quality of life with the community. That's the key. It's with the community. And again, can't have this us versus them mentality. Remember what Peel said, we are the police and the police are, we're both part of it. The community is the police and the police are the community. We have to think that way. No insiders, no outsiders. Then here's something that I think some of you have probably heard of. And especially I want to talk a little bit about after 9/11. So this concept of guardians or warriors. And unfortunately, the police, are often seen as soldiers or warriors instead of guardians. And why that's important is, think about it yourselves. You certainly probably would not want to, drive around in your community and have each and every police officer look like they're ready to go to war. And in some departments, it kind of looks like that. They have gloves on. They're ready for literally a battle, instead of this concept of, trying to be a part of the community and not being this warrior mentality. And I just threw this in here, both carry uniforms, both wear uniforms, both carry weapons, but it ends there. They're completely different. The soldier's mission is that of a warrior to conquer. Rules of engagement are decided before the battle, but the police officer's mission is that of a guardian to protect and to serve. And that's really important. The rules of engagement evolve as the incident unfolds. Soldiers must follow orders, but police officers make independent decisions all the time. Soldiers come into communities as an outside occupying force. Guardians are members of the community and protect from within. And that follows Peel's concept. So I'm not going to go through this, but there's a lot to traditional policing and what community policing is. But I think I've got that horse beat a little bit that you guys can get that. So I don't want to flip through that. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is what may be a term you haven't heard. And this is the term of procedural justice and why this is important in law enforcement. So this refers to the idea of fairness in the processes that resolve disputes and allocate resources. And when we think about allocating resources, imagine you live in an area that's challenged. Maybe there is some crime that's occurring there. And then maybe you live in an affluent area where there's perceived and maybe there's no crime. How does the police department allocate the resources, police officers, and technology within those different areas of the community? How should we do that? Should we decide, or should we get some community input on how to do that? I think sometimes most of you familiar with the Chicago Police Department and some of the issues. There's all kinds of issues on where resources are sent. Are they sent to the areas that have lots of crime, or are they sent to the areas that are affluent and have very little crime? And is there a balance that can be struck? And what's the priority, right? So I remember when Chicago Housing Authority used to police the projects. Chicago police kind of gave up on that, and they had a separate police department that policed the projects. That's an instance where resources were taken away from those that needed them the most, and another entity had to come in to police. And that didn't last so long, and it was an interesting experiment, but ultimately didn't work. So it's it concerns the fairness and the transparency of the processes by which decisions are made. And this has to do with externally in the community, but it also has to do with internally within the department. So I just want you to think about a police department that isn't run with fairness, doesn't give voice to the individual officers, is not transparent in what they do, and it's not equal or fair in what they do. So there's a lot of departments where maybe I'll give you just quick examples. So if there's a chief that has his guys that he's friendly with, and maybe he even golfs with them, who's more likely to get promoted in that department? Is that fair? And what happens to that officer who feels that he was part of an unfair process and now he goes out into the street to work with the community? Oh boy, he's not going to have a good attitude. He's not going to feel like he cares about the community. So internally and externally, this is unbelievably important. And interestingly enough, this has a lot to do with the perception of the community and how they are treated by the police. I could tell you that there's study after study that shows that if you're stopped for a violation, a traffic stop, and I know all of you are perfect citizens and perfect drivers. You've never been stopped. Although I know some of you are leadfoots and used to drive some hot cars. But imagine that you're stopped. And if the officer is very much, like Jack Webb, give me your license, give me your registration. I'm issuing you a ticket for, speeding or whatever it is, hands you the information, walks away. There's no discourse, there's no, what are we, and then compare that with somebody who stops you, introduces themselves, asks you, do you know why I stopped you? There's maybe in this case, there's kids that are playing here, we're here for a reason. It's not simply to just write tickets. We want you to understand this is about safety, and has a conversation with you, and you get to say what happened. You get to say you weren't paying attention, or, whatever's causing you to speed that day. What they find time and time again, the fact that that individual was allowed to have voice, was allowed to have this, connection conversation with the police officer, they are much more satisfied with that encounter, even if they get the ticket. So that's hugely important. So, just the facts, ma'am, isn't going to work today. You need to have a relationship, build that relationship. And, a former superintendent of Chicago said every day, he has 13,000, commercials or opportunities to have a good impression with the community, whether that's a traffic stop or calls for service or whatever it is. You either, as a police officer, you either make a deposit into the community bank account, or you make a withdrawal in the community bank account, right? And the superintendent's wife had gotten stopped in a traffic stop. And guess what? It was not a deposit, it was a withdrawal. So the whole concept of, how we treat people and how we give them voice in whatever the issue is. It could be that, somebody is getting arrested. It could be a domestic at a home. We have to allow voice. We have to be transparent about the systems and the processes. If we're going to write a ticket, this is why we're doing it. If we're going to make an arrest, this is why we're going to do it. So the process is transparent. We give voice. It's fair. There's equity in what we do. And that's how we need to go forward. It seems like a really simple concept, but it's interesting how a lot of police departments don't necessarily follow these simple processes. So again, fairness, voice, transparency, impartiality, internally and externally. So let's talk a little bit about police officers today, and hopefully what our police departments look like. So I know you're all on mute, so I'll have to answer for you. But when you look at this picture of the 1935, and that could be 1945, that could be 1955, police candidates, I think you'll all notice some glaring facts. One, they're all white, and two, they're all male, right? Not a lot of diversity there, and how much of a problem is that? We see community after community, have issues with law enforcement in the community because there is no representation, of populations within the police department, which means there's a whole lot larger propensity for bias, whether that's overt bias or it's a subconscious bias. So that's a huge issue today. And certainly communities of color are looking at police departments to have more representation of those populations and demographics of the communities that they serve for a whole host of reasons. So I think that, maybe if you looked at, the issue in Ferguson and you looked at the demographics within that department and, also the relationships that they probably could have done a better job of having within the community, those are key issues today. So certainly that's something important. But I wanted to say that, oftentimes police departments, don't necessarily what we call select in candidates. Their whole process is designed to select out candidates, right? You didn't meet this, you didn't do this, you didn't do this on some criteria that's been set. Whether that criteria is important to the community, may or may not be true. I remember when I got hired in my first police department, they gave us a swimming test, which seems to make sense. You got pools, you got Chicago River, you got certainly, out here, you got all kinds of lakes, and maybe the police, might have to, actually save somebody by swimming. But I'm going to just be this guy that says back in those days, I think that was a way to select out, in this case, candidates of color. So many in the Black community, never have the opportunity to learn how to swim. And I wonder in the back of my mind, was that a way to select out certain candidates to be
Bruce, there's a problem with your video. You're frozen.
And audio too. I can't hear either.
Yep. Uh-oh, you must be trying to relog in.
Mary, do you want to, or Jean, do you want to ask people if they want, should we go to the criminal justice stuff until he comes back? The next point on the agenda?
Mary?
Yeah. Well, Judy. You're muted.
Yeah. And Linda too.
Well, Linda left.
Oh, she left. Oh, yeah.
So the committee that we established from the leagues that are going to be doing consensus studies has been meeting every week, and we divided up.
Judy,
What?
he's coming back here.
Just coming in.
I'm sorry, I wore out the internet. I was talking so much, I think I wore it out, which is terrible. I'm so sorry.
Not a problem.
Okay, I'm gonna jump back in, and I apologize. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we recruit and select police officers, which I think you'll find kind of interesting. And I especially want to talk about 9/11. And for those of you who don't know, I spent 28 and a half years in the Marine Corps and the Marine Corps Reserve. I get it. But when we're going to hire police officers, what are we looking for? And I'll tell you what happened after 9/11. We actually looked for a lot of former military, and that former military, not all, but some that we were hiring, they were really looking for the action, adventure, the adrenaline, that rush that you get from going into in progress and violent, calls, car chases and all the rest. And, the reality is that even in busy communities, especially in the suburbs, maybe 20% of your time is spent on those kinds of activities. The other 80% is spent on serving the community and working with the community. So you have very, very small percentage of those high adrenaline situations. So the reality is most of the time of police officers, and especially in our suburbs, they're service-related activities, not, crime fighting, et cetera. So, and I hope you can all see this. Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yep, we're still good? Okay. So the concept that we're looking at now is hiring in the spirit of service. So you want to hire individuals to become police officers that want to serve, not just want to arrest bad guys and put them in, jail and prison. So to meet the community policing missions, a lot of agencies are looking at hiring in the spirit of services. Look at individuals who are drawn to and exhibit characteristics in line with the service element of policing over the prospect of adventure or crime fighting. So that's a different personality. Now, nothing against my military brothers and sisters, but that is a different personality. One that wants to solve problems with the community, build relationships with the community, not just wait to be dispatched to a, an in progress call. And I think that's really important. And there's a lot of individuals that might never have thought about being a police officer that actually should be thinking about being a police officer. So really we want those individuals that may already volunteer for a police department or come from a family where they do volunteer work within the community. How great would that be to find those individuals? So when I got hired, I know that look at me. I was the poster child of a Marine when I got hired. I was the spitting image of that Marine in the dress blues. I really was. I was that guy. And I'm sure that's why I got hired. Did they look at my communication skills? No. Did they look at my judgment and ability to solve problems? No, they didn't. Did they look at my ability to multitask? No, they didn't. And the list goes on. So how do you work as a team? All those things, be adaptable, flexible, certainly integrity and ethics, ability to handle stress, okay, well, those things I probably looked like I could do that. But we're looking for a different kind of police officer. And if you ask, supervisors in police departments, they would say somebody that has good communication skills, verbal and written, somebody that can, certainly work as a team, somebody that can, help to solve problems and make relationships, good relationships with the community. So now I'm going to switch real quick and I want to tell you something that's interesting. So how do we find police officers, right? And this is so fascinating to me because we kind of do the same things over and over and over again. Again, definition of insanity. We put advertisements in the paper and, we put information out to the community. And what's interesting is we keep getting the same individuals to apply for our police departments. Let's say that we want to be more diverse. We want more diversity within our department. We want to be able to represent the demographics of our community. So we put the advertisements in the paper. Maybe some departments now do it in English and Spanish, maybe, but sometimes that doesn't even happen. And then they wonder why nobody shows up to the test that, is part of a diverse community culture. So I was doing a training for national trainers, and I thought this was great. We paired up police with academic, really smart social scientists and the like. And in this one teaming, we had a police captain and we had a person that was an elected official for a city. And, as we were talking about this, and I was talking about, not doing the same thing over and over again and not expanding your horizons to market to other entities to find this diversity within the community. This individual says that, he teaches part-time at a local historically Black college. And that's in this city. And he teaches criminal justice. And he actually mentioned in class in front of everybody, it was like the first time he had thought about it, but in all the years he's been teaching, no one from the police department has ever come to his classes at the historical Black college to talk about becoming a police officer in that city. Do you see how that's like a disconnect? And you could almost see the light bulb go on in that police captain and him going, oh my gosh, how did I miss that? How do we miss that? And there's a million other examples, whether that's in, our faith-based, entities, whether that's, finding people in the community that are just awesome people that might have a relative or a son or a daughter who might be interested. But we have to look at, how we get police officers differently. And I just want to spend a little bit of time about talking about once we have those police officers, how do we evaluate them? How do we promote them and how do we retain them? And what we're finding is police departments that embrace community policing, procedural justice, and they evaluate their officers differently, meaning not by how many tickets they've written, not by how many misdemeanor or felony arrests they've written, not by how many DUIs they've made, but how they interact with the community, how they help to solve problems with the community. Very hard to measure, and very few police departments bother to evaluate their officers on anything other than simple metrics. And that's part of the problem, because if we don't evaluate them on how they work, and I
Bruce,
know you guys are
there you go. You're
much
back.
smarter than the average group. So I hope that makes sense to you. Nope,
going
sounds
in
like we're
now.
good.
Bruce,
Okay.
Bruce, we were cutting in and out again.
Uh-oh, I'm hoping I didn't lose you.
And I think that you were making an important point because you followed it up with, you hope that made sense to us. But I don't think we heard most of your point. Jeannie, would you agree with that, or was that?
Yeah,
just-
I agree with that. And so when I started talking, he started talking. So what was your point, Bruce? Oh, did you lose you altogether, Bruce, again? Let's see.
It looks like he's gone again.
I'm on my phone.
Oh,
Okay, you're on your
Can
phone?
you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, but I figured since it doesn't look like I've got a stable connection on my computer, I'm grabbing my phone. So, Jeannie, I think what you're saying is, what's the point?
Yes,
What you're making.
yes.
So go ahead, Judy.
No, you were making a point to us because you followed it up with, you hope that made sense, and were there questions, and you paused a moment. And most of what you were saying on that point, you were kind of in a dead zone on the internet.
Sorry about that. So the point that I was trying to make is that we evaluate police officers based on simple metrics. You know, how many tickets you've written, arrests you've made, DUIs you've made. And we don't evaluate police officers on how they interact with the community and how they help to problem solve within the community, because it's not easy to evaluate. So it's not simple metrics, you know, by this number. And no offense to police, but they're not usually, they're pretty good with simple numbers. But this concept of how do we evaluate the interaction of police officers within the community is a difficult one for police departments to document. And this is the most important point. If you're evaluating me based on how many tickets I write and how many arrests I make, then that tells me what you as a police department value. And the reality is that I know that if I'm only evaluated on those things, that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to have these relationship building, efforts in the community. I'm not going to build those partnerships, and I'm not going to problem solve, because while I'm problem solving, I'm not writing tickets, and I'm not making arrests, which also means I'm not going to get promoted. Right. So if you value simple metrics, it's a problem. And I think a vast majority of police departments in the United States, measure police officers based on these simple metrics. In fact, I was doing a training in Yuma, Arizona. This is probably about a year and a half ago. And I did a 3-day training, and I almost, did a double or triple take when they said that they used the same evaluation for their public works employees and the clerks within the city as they do the police officers. And I spent the next half of a day going, that's not going to work. And we need to develop our own, evaluation system for the police department. And by the time I was done, I know they understood it, and they were going to go back to the city to change it. And the city of Yuma, it's not small. It's a pretty large, expansive police department and community. So, but that's the point. You value what you evaluate. So that's what's seen by officers. So I know this is a little bit off the beaten track, but I think it's important. So we don't want to evaluate our officers as crime fighters. We want to evaluate them as problem solvers, community organizers, coordinators, planners, and mediators. So to Peel's point, what's police legitimacy and why do we care about this? Why do we care if the police are seen as legitimate? And again, our social scientists are awesome. And they talk about, why people obey the law. And I just think this is fascinating. So most of us would probably think people obey the law because they have a fear of consequences or the deterrence mindset. So you fear you're going to get the ticket, so you obey the law. You fear you're going to get arrested and go to jail or prison, so you obey the law. There's another perspective that if even criminals believe that law enforcement is legitimate, that and they feel that that is the right thing to do, and that's why you obey the law, because it's the right thing to do. And interestingly enough, criminals obey the law much more than they don't obey the law. That's just reality. But what the scientists have found, and this came from Yale University, that if you look at these three factors of why people obey the law, and the three factors are morality, legitimacy, and deterrence. So why do people obey the law? At the very bottom in green, that smallest number is the deterrence factor. So whether they're going to have a consequence, get arrested, get a ticket, etc., that's not long lasting. Morality and legitimacy is where, and this is their argument, is that's where we should focus our police efforts, not in deterrence, but on legitimacy of the police, because you can't affect morality. That's really hard for the police to do. In some cases, maybe. There's probably some kids I've worked with, over all my years that I've helped in that regard. But the reality for police, we have to focus on legitimacy. So are we seen as legitimate within the community? And I want you to think about certain areas of Chicago or certain suburbs that you're familiar with. Are the police seen as legitimate within that community? And why is that important? Well, this is the crux of everything. It's the crux of law enforcement now and into the future. If you're not seen as legitimate, people are not going to obey the law. They are not going to cooperate with you. They are not going to form partnerships with you. So there are certain areas, for sure in the city and in some suburbs where they have a lot of work to do to work on their legitimacy within the community. I hope that makes sense. And I'm not sure how much time I have, so I wanted to get into restorative justice and talk a little bit about that. And I'm actually going to see if I can get back on with my bigger PowerPoint so you guys can see some of this. And I promise I will try to go through it fairly quickly so that, okay, I'm going to turn off my phone.
Bruce, Gene, if he wants to send his PowerPoint to me in an email attachment, and I can bring it up on my screen.
All right, I'm sure between Judy and I, we'll get that communicated to him. And
Yeah.
Oh, you mean for right now?
Yeah, could do it right now
Okay.
if he has a problem, but it looks like it's working.
Looks
all right.
like it's fine. Yep.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I'm
We
back.
can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, and I'm going to pick up right at restorative justice and the foundations of those principles, because I know this is also a big part of what the league is looking at. And I will try to go quickly because I know I don't want to keep you all afternoon, and I probably have about 3 days worth of material. So this is great. Restorative justice is a process where the parties with a stake in a particular offense or harm come together to collectively resolve how to deal with the aftermath of the offense, repair the harm, and its implications for the future. This is totally different than crime and punishment, okay? So today, we typically, when we ask about crime, who committed the crime, what laws are broken, and then how are we gonna punish the offender, right? That's how we look at it. Well, restorative justice looks at it through a completely different lens, that the crime is a wound and justice should be a healing process. So I'm going to just go through a couple of these principles because they are going to maybe alter your perspective on the criminal justice system. Maybe they will. So Van Ness came up with these principles. If crime is more than law breaking, then justice requires that we work to heal victims, communities, and the offenders who have been injured by the crime. So the concept is that all parties are injured by that crime. Again, number two, victims, communities, and offenders should have opportunities for active involvement in the justice process as early and as fully as possible. That means that, you see what it says, the offender actually has involvement in the justice process as well. So we're listening, of course, to the victim, but also the offender and whoever that victim is. It could be a person, it could be the community, it could be a school. The third principle, we have to rethink the roles and responsibilities of government and the community. Government is responsible for preserving a just order, and community for establishing a just peace. I'm going to talk about what this looks like a little bit more. Restorative justice is not a program. It's a mission or philosophical framework, just like community policing. And it's a different way of responding to crime in communities and within the criminal justice system. So these questions are important. First, what's the harm, right? So what is the harm? And as you think about a criminal offense, it could be anything. It could be a theft from your vehicle. It could be, some kind of assault or battery. It could be, a bullying incident, even in a school. So what needs to be done to repair the harm, and who is responsible for the repair? So you've got the offender's interests, the victim's interests, the community interests, and where all three come together, right? So what is the harm question is the assessment. So whatever the offense is, whatever happened. And then what needs to be done to repair the harm? Well, how do you think you find that out? To repair what needs to be done, we find out from the victim. We find out from the community. We also can find out from the offender, because interestingly enough, they may have opinions on what should happen. Think about your kids. They knew they were going to get a consequence. I'm sure many of them tried to have some influence in what that consequence was. And then finally, who's responsible for the repair? And I'm going to show you what this looks like in practice with a program that we have. But these are different ways to look at, justice. So balanced and restorative justice looks very different. I can tell you that, I spent 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, and I only dealt with insurgent terrorist offenses, and I worked in a military police role. So when I had individuals that had been put through the justice system and put into a prison, interestingly enough, some of those individuals were released back into their community, which was the village where they came from. And they were released to the village elders, and the village elders had a shura to decide how they were going to bring this person back into their community, their village, and who is going to take responsibility for that individual coming back. Very interesting perspective. I shared with Judy, I took a trip to Rwanda and Uganda with my son, who is studying post-genocide reconstruction. In Rwanda, I know all of you are familiar with the genocide that took place there. It wasn't even that long ago. We went to places where 5, 10, or 50,000 people were slaughtered with machetes. It was unbelievable. Nobody that committed those offenses went to prison for more than 20 years. All of them, while they were in prison, worked within the community and within the country to repair the country. When they were done with their sentence in 20 years, they were welcomed back into the community. Isn't that crazy? 5, 10, 50,000 lives lost, literally macheted, and nobody gets life sentence and nobody gets put to death. I just think that's amazing. And that may be a real interesting example. So the values of restorative justice: crime is an act against a person or the community, not the state. Crime hurts the victims, the communities, and the offenders. and especially our young offenders. And I'm going to share an example. Crime creates an obligation to make things right. And that's an interesting way. You know, paying a fine, does that make it right with a victim? I don't know. Restitution of some kind might, but paying a fine to the court, I don't know that that's actually making it right for anybody. All parties should be a part of the response. The victim, if they want to be, the community, and the offender. Very interesting perspective on restorative justice. The victim's perspective is central to deciding how to repair the harm. Offender accountability means accepting responsibility and acting to repair the harm. So we have a teen court program. You have to admit guilt to be allowed to be in our teen court program. It's a non-starter unless you admit guilt. It's just the way it is. You're not going to have behavioral change if you don't admit that guilt. So offender accountability means accepting responsibility and acting to repair the harm. Community must ensure that all process gives equal protection to all. The offender takes primary responsibility for making things right, as they should. They should take responsibility. And restoration places punishment for its own sake as the primary goal of criminal justice. So it's not the punishment that you may expect. Restitution is the rule, not the exception, so they have to make it right. Doesn't mean monetarily. Results are measured by repair done, not amount and severity of the punishment. You know, if wouldn't it be great if somebody committed an offense against you and they actually took responsibility and said they were sorry? Oh my gosh, I think all of us on this call today would be like, wow, that's a breath of fresh air, right? We don't have the offender and their parents, you know, saying, oh no, they didn't do it. Oh no, you know, take responsibility, say you're sorry, whatever that could be all that the victim requires. Controlling crime is mainly done by the community, not the police and the court system. Offender is accountable for individual acts. Community is accountable for conditions which contribute to crime. That's interesting. So we're all responsible for that. And victims and offenders are full members of communities and participants in the process. So everybody's together. And, you know, you think of the Native American traditions of, you know, how they actually settle these issues, you know, whether you call it a peace circle or whatever you want to call it, but talk through the problem, you know, take responsibility, and how do you make it right? In days gone by, that could be giving some kind of livestock to the victim. That could be giving something, maybe of value to the victim. But that's how these things were dealt with. So restorative justice, very different. Real quick on Nicasa's teen court, we use balanced and restorative justice. So it's an alternative to the criminal justice system. We have a peer jury. So we actually have teens who are trained in restorative justice, and they act as the bailiff, the defense attorney, the prosecuting attorney, and most importantly, the jury. So balanced and restorative justice, you know, defines crime as more than simply breaking the law. And I won't go through all of this, but they don't go through a traditional criminal justice system. The peers are actually, I think, sometimes tougher on them than what is the criminal justice system. If they go to branch court, get a slap on the wrist, mommy and daddy pay a fine, and it's all said and done. There's no behavior change. In this case, you admit, take responsibility for what you've done, and then we figure out how to make it right with the victim. And oh my gosh, that looks so different for each and every person. We take all these offenses, every one of these, and you can be eligible for teen court. So from possession and use of a weapon to alcohol, substances, retail theft, but they may write letters to the victims. They may do a project where they have to do a poster. I'll give you one quick one that I loved. We had a Round Lake girl that committed an offense, and the jury asked her what she wanted to do with her life. What did she want to do in the future? And she wanted to be a beautician. She wanted to go to beauty school and be a beautician. It just so happened that Round Lake High School has Mario Tricoci come in every year, and they do makeup and hair for the kids that have no money for homecoming, prom, you know, that kind of a thing. So what did the teens do? They sentenced her to work with Mario Tricoci on that day. And wouldn't you know it, when it was all done and she did her whole day of working and helping these other kids, they did her hair and makeup too, so she looked great but the parents, the victim, the offender, everybody was so satisfied with this and thought this was the greatest, way to go forward. And the teens come up with these creative ideas time after time after time. It's teen driven. We facilitate, but it's teen driven. So awesome stuff. And that's just an example of what is balanced and restorative justice. So I'm going to go through that real quick. Again, lots of sentences, lots of things they can do. We've got great examples here that I love. I love these stories of what they do. Now I want to get to something that's kind of interesting. And Jeannie, you tell me if I am wearing out my welcome.
No, not right now. I don't think you
Okay.
are.
All right.
Everybody's shaking their head no.
Get the cane when you need to get the cane and pull me off. Okay. This is a great concept though. When we're talking about this concept of criminal justice and deflection and diversion, and why I think this is just so valuable for the future of policing and law enforcement. So think of the concept here, and I'm gonna give you some practical examples, and then we're gonna talk about what this actually looks like in a slide. So I want you to think about somebody that is struggling with a mental health crisis. It could be, an adult, it could be an adolescent, and this person is struggling, and the family calls the police. And the police come and, they're trying to control the situation. Hopefully, they're trained in crisis intervention team training, hopefully, so they know how to respond, how they should act with this individual to de-escalate the situation. Because, police cars, lights and sirens, police officers coming out with guns and weapons and badges and all kinds of stuff, and often putting a flashlight in your face. Does that de-escalate or escalate a situation, right? We're our own worst enemy many times. So, but I just want you to think through this. So this individual may or may not commit an offense against the police. Maybe because of the way the police responded, they actually pushed the police or hit the police or end up fighting with the police. So what happens? That individual basically today has two choices. You're either going to go to the hospital or you're probably going to jail. Is that what the family wants? Is that what anybody wants? It's certainly not what the police want. So the idea is, can we intercept in that situation? And can we have a different outcome for that individual? So police don't get hurt, our citizens don't get hurt, and they go somewhere other than the jail or to a hospital. And typically when they go to the hospital, they're out in 8 to 12 hours, and they're probably going to commit an offense in the town where they're let out, which in Lake County is usually Waukegan. So all kinds of issues come with that. You could imagine, whether it's somebody that has a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, what else can we do instead of putting them into the criminal justice system and exacerbating the problem for that individual as well as the family? Can you imagine the costs involved of going into the criminal justice system? Having to appear in court. Transportation is a nightmare. So we have a lot of people that can't get to court. They don't appear in court, warrants get issued, and now they're getting arrested for a warrant for failure to appear. And it compounds itself. Meanwhile, the person that has the mental health issue, are they getting help? Are they getting cared for? Are they getting what they need so that they don't, intersect again with the police or the fire departments? We have one fire department in Lake County that's actually going to their high utilizers, those individuals that, constantly call the fire department for any issue, whether it's they haven't taken their meds, they're on psychotropic medications or whatever. This fire department is going to those individuals at 2 p.m. and saying, how you doing? Have you taken your meds? Is there anything we can do for you? Instead of 2 or 3 a.m. when the police get there, and now you have, some kind of melee, and it's a terrible situation. So you can kind of see the idea here. We want to intercept with the police, with these individuals, not at the end, which is Intercept 5, where they're already in the criminal justice system. They're already, and I'm going to show you, if you look at Intercept 4, they're in jail or prison and they're coming out, and now we work with them, or they're in community corrections. So they've been given a sentence to be in community corrections, and they're back in the community and we're working with them. But if you go to the beginning, and really Intercept 1 is not the beginning, we added an Intercept 0. But 1 is when the police departments have contact with these individuals, how can we appropriately do something with them so they don't end up in the criminal justice system? I was talking to Judy, and some of you know we've been working on getting a crisis center in Lake County. And I think I'm in my 5th year of working on trying to get a crisis center with so many other people. Chair Hart is leading the push to make this happen. So Sandy Hart's been pushing, the sheriff, the health department, everybody's pushing on this. And the idea would be, wouldn't it be great if the police could pick individuals up for, that are in crisis, mental health, substance abuse, and bring them to a place that can help these individuals instead of, again, jail and, a hospital. And we pay for those hospital, the costs are crazy. So much better use of time. So we want to actually, there's a 0 Intercept, and it's on this model. And this Intercept, and maybe if I do this, it'll show up bigger. I'm not sure. Let's see. Tell me if this shows up bigger. Is that any bigger, I hope?
No, it's smaller on mine. The other one was easier to read.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me go back.
I think you're frozen again.
Yeah, you are, Bruce. Let me open up and see if he's trying to get back on. Yep, there he is. Okay. We're readmitting him.
All right, I'm back on my phone.
Okay.
I'm so sorry again, but I'll leave it. I'm glad the slide. Hopefully you're seeing the slide.
You can see it.
Intercept 0 is actually, this is where it's probably my computer. It looks like it's restarting. We got all kinds of problems. But Intercept 0 would be where the individual doesn't even have to go and be involved with the police. So imagine, if you will, we had the crisis center, and we had this place where a family could take their family member to when they're having a crisis. They don't need to call the police. They don't need to even involve the police. Or if it's a homeless person that is already familiar with this crisis center, and they know if they go there, they can get snacks. They could clean their clothes in a washer and dryer. They can get some kind of a feeling of self-worth because they're now clean and somebody cares about them. And sometimes that's all it takes, is some kind of human contact with individuals. And these could be veterans. These could be anybody that's homeless. We're going to deal with many more people that are going to be looking for, that are going to be, unfortunately, homeless in our future. So we've got all kinds of issues. We need places for people to go. And look, if we don't need to have law enforcement involvement, all the better. That's all the better. So I'm hoping that this concept of diversion and deflection from the criminal justice system makes sense to you. I had a PowerPoint queued up to share with you, but I'll just explain it. So those of you that have not heard of the Way Out program, Lake County started the Way Out program through the Lake County Opioid Initiative. And now imagine this. Talk about law enforcement deflection and diversion. We have more than 750 people that have come into a police department and said, I need help. They're struggling with substance abuse. They may have, co-occurring with mental health, and they come in the police department. And if they brought in a kilo of heroin and they said they need help, the police department takes the kilo of heroin, puts it into, property inventory, does not charge them with it, and puts them into treatment. How great is that 750 police individuals, have trusted law enforcement to actually come in the police department, say they need help, and get connected to treatment. And our state's attorney has even said, even if you have a warrant for your arrest, he works it out so that that he gets you up on a bond hearing very quickly the next morning and gets you to treatment. So the whole concept is, you know, we have to help individuals that are struggling. And I had a bunch of slides to show you and some statistics, but that's an example of law enforcement deflection and diversion from the criminal justice system. And, you know, certainly you can't get stopped by the police with a kilo of, you know, heroin and then say, oh no, I need help, I want to go to treatment. You know, that's not going to work. But if you come in the police department and say, I need help, and we often see that people forget that they have drugs on them. They may even forget that they have a weapon on them. And the police, you know, for every single person that's come into a police department in Lake County, they've been connected to treatment and not had to face the arrest for, you know, for what they had on them. So I just think that's huge, but that's an example of diversion and deflection. We see it a lot with mental health and substance abuse, but it can also be done with misdemeanor offenses or some felony offenses. So there's no reason you can't divert. There's no reason you can't get somebody help. We see it in veterans court and drug court and mental health court. So I've seen veterans that have struggled. You know, there's one case where there's a veteran that was sitting on a curb and somebody called in suspicious person or something. So the police came to check on him. And of course they tapped him on the shoulder. And the first reaction of this veteran was fight or flight. So they turned around and whacked the police officer and ended up in a whole thing. And ultimately, thank goodness the veteran was put into veterans court. He got help with anger management, you know, got connected to a veteran mentor. And ultimately that offense didn't go on his record. So that's the kind of deflection, diversion from, and it's not necessarily easier. You know, drug court in Lake County can take 30 months of oversight by a judge and a whole team of professionals, and could include periodic incarceration where, you know, you do something you shouldn't have done. You may spend the next weekend in jail. So, but ultimately in 30 months, it's beautiful because the people that graduate from drug court, that police department is brought in, the police chief usually comes, and 99 out of 100 times, the person thanks the police department for intercepting them and where they were going and helping them to get on the right track. And for some of them, save their lives.
Yeah,
So-
it really is kind of phenomenal. Bruce, forgive me for interrupting here. Normally we try to be completely wrapped up by 2:00. We
Yep.
do have a meeting that we abbreviated on purpose so
Yep.
that we can get it done in about 20-30 minutes. If you have some additional points you want to make, or if you want to take some questions, I think it's a good time to kind of evaluate your closeout so that we can be finished within another 15 minutes or so.
I'll do it in less time. And I thank you for getting the hook for me. So here's what I would say. I think I covered the areas that you wanted me to cover, except for funding. And I had a few slides relative to funding, and I just suffice to say that there are a lot of opportunities for funding for police departments. And I have a list of entities, federal, mostly federal, that provide funding. We just got, the state's attorney's office just got a Bureau of Justice Assistance grant that includes the sheriff's department and Nicasa. And that it's really gauged towards this crisis center, but it's going to pay for some staffing at that crisis center. And it's $750,000. We have had, Nicasa has had millions and millions and millions of dollars that we've written for and gotten in grants that provide for us to do after school and in school programming for kids that are struggling. You know, and I remember, you know, as a young police chief, I applied to the COPS office for community-oriented policing, and I got multiple I think I got salaries and was able to hire 4 officers. I got cars outfitted. I got technology. I got all kinds of stuff. And there's lots of opportunities from the National Highway Traffic Safety Association. There's Department of Transportation funds. So there's lots of funding mechanisms for police departments. And one that we're currently using is from the MacArthur Foundation. And I'll send my entire slide deck, and it has a jail high utilizer program that we're doing with the sheriff's department. But I have intensive case managers and peer recovery specialists that go into the jail, work with individuals, and when they come out of jail, we catch them. And if they need employment, housing, mental health, substance abuse, whatever they need, we help them to get it so they don't go back to jail over and over and over again. So there is funding for that. And MacArthur, first time in Lake County that the sheriff's, any funding came to Lake County, and it was through the sheriff's department. So fantastic, and we're lucky to be a part of it. So funding, I love what the former chief of Mundelein said, Eric Gunther. You know, he said, look, if you want to make a difference, like we did with the A Way Out program, don't use money as an excuse. And we know, you know, and I'm looking at Judy, she's the only one on my screen right now. But we know in the Round Lake area, we don't have a lot of money, but it never stopped us from doing good things in the community. So you can't always use money as an excuse. You know, and I worked at Schaumburg before I came up to the Round Lake area. And, you know, I used to say that Schaumburg could buy their way out of issues and problems in the community. You know, they could spend a lot of money. What we did in the Round Lake areas, we got a lot of volunteers, people that rolled up their sleeves to make that difference. So I just want to say about funding, you can't use that as an excuse not to make a difference and to do things right. I'll leave it there. And if anybody has a question, I'm happy to answer.
Jane? Looks like Jane has her hand up, Jean.
Jane, you're
Can you unmute her?
yep, I asked her to unmute. Let's see if I can physically unmute her. Jane, let's see.
There I am.
There you go.
Have you been asked to work with the Chicago Police Department?
It's interesting that you asked me that. So yes, but in a different capacity. I don't know if you're aware that the Chicago Police Department has a consent decree, which means the federal government has been asked to come in to help them to police differently. And I actually, because I do work with another entity, and I'm written into that consent decree. So I should have a piece in training with the Chicago Police Department for that consent decree. And you know, they need help, and there's a lot of communities that need help, and most of it stems around relationships with the community. And in some of their communities, they have lost all resemblance of a relationship. And you don't have a relationship, you don't have legitimacy, you can't partner, you're going to go nowhere. And that just means you're going to have, you know, it's going to be an us and them until somebody's able to break down the barriers and the walls. So hopefully we're going to help them to do that. The way consent decrees work are that basically the federal government says you need to agree to this if you want funding, if you want help, if you want anything. And so the mayor, everybody's bought into it, but that's like eating an elephant. And you got to do that one bite at a time. And it takes a long time to change the culture of such a big department.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Laura?
I hope
This has been wonderful.
I.
Can you share with us what you think the biggest barriers are to a broader acceptance of restorative justice beyond the teen court into a more generalized adult court that's not substance abuse based?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you're trying to look at the obstacles and barriers for, you know, trying to have a broader restorative justice process and system. And I think it's the systems themselves that are the problem. So, you know, the traditional justice system, and we're lucky in Lake County. I think I shared some links, you know, the Lake County, the state's attorney, public defender, you know, the sheriff, we have a lot of entities that are trying to do what would be restorative justice and what is deflection and diversion. But it's a difficult system to overhaul. I think as a community, you know, and in this case, it's the county and the state. There has to be a more education, more understanding, and a shift in culture that that the system that we have, which is, deterrence based, it's based on, some kind of penalty, distributive justice for the offender, doesn't always take into the account of the victim. And it involves a process of courts, which are huge behemoths of systems, and difficult to change in culture. So we see the embracement of drug court, mental health court, and veterans court. I think that's the beginning of what could be a good foundation, an example of restorative justice. But the truth is, I don't know that we as a society have gotten to the point where we've universally accepted and said we want to have this. And I like you, think it's really important, and it's something where you have a chance to change behavior, to help people to see things differently. And it's just, that's where we're going to have to try to get to. But I think you're smart for looking at, hey, there's big obstacles and barriers to this. If the community has the will to make it happen, then we can make the systems change. And there are examples, in the United States and outside of the United States of entities that are doing this better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I see no more hands up. Okay, we're good.
Bruce, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all.
You did amazing.
Yes, thank you very much.
I wish I could see you all in person.
Soon.
Yeah.
Turn
I
around.
wish you health, and everybody be safe. And if you need me again for anything, I'm happy to help.
Thanks.
Thank you. Really
Okay.
appreciate it, Bruce.
Bye-bye.
Take good care.
Bye.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeannie, are we ready to
Yep, you're ready to
move
move.
on?
Yep.
Are you going to turn something off?
Yes, I'm going to turn that off as soon as there it is. Okay.